Her room stinks of decay, my daughter-in-law whispered into her phone, not knowing I was standing right behind the door. The words hit me like ice water in my veins. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Eleanor Wells. I'm 79 years old, and this is the story of how the people I gave my entire life to made me feel like I didn't belong in my own son's house, or anywhere else in this world. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of Andrew's sprawling estate in suburban Chicago, casting long shadows across the marble countertops that always felt cold beneath my fingertips. I stood there in my faded blue house dress, the same one I'd worn to feed chickens on our family farm for 30 years, feeling completely out of place in this modern mansion that my son and his wife called home. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped my ceramic coffee mug, the one I'd brought from the farmhouse. It was chipped along the rim, stained from decades of morning routines, but it held the warmth better than those thin, expensive cups Jessica preferred. The tremor wasn't new. Parkinson's had been creeping into my life like an unwelcome visitor, making simple tasks feel like mountains to climb. The house around me hummed with the quiet efficiency of wealth, marble floors that echoed every footstep, walls painted in colors Jessica called sophisticated neutrals, but reminded me of storm clouds, crystal light fixtures that cast everything in harsh clinical brightness. Nothing soft, nothing warm, nothing that whispered home the way our old farmhouse had, with its creaking wooden floors and sun-faded wallpaper that George had helped me hang when Andrew was just learning to walk. I'd been living here for 8 months now, ever since Andrew insisted I move in after George's funeral. "Mom, you can't stay on that farm alone," he'd said, his voice carrying that tone children use when they've already made decisions for their parents. "Jessica and I have plenty of space. It'll be easier for everyone." Easier. That word had haunted me for months. The guest room they'd given me sat at the far end of the house, next to the laundry room where the washing machine hummed day and night. Andrew said it was more convenient since I wouldn't have to climb stairs. But I knew the truth. It was as far from their lives as they could place me while still claiming they cared. The room smelled of fabric softener and industrial cleaner. Nothing like the lavender sachets I'd kept in my dresser drawers for 40 years. My few belongings looked lost in the space. George's reading glasses on the nightstand, our wedding photo in its tarnished silver frame, the quilt my mother had sewn that now seemed shabby against Jessica's designer bedding. Every morning, I tried to make myself useful. I'd wake before dawn, as I had for decades on the farm, and tiptoe to the kitchen to start coffee. I'd wipe down counters that were already spotless, arrange flowers from Jessica's garden that she'd mentioned were going to waste anyway, and prepare small breakfasts that no one ever seemed to want. The twins, Ben and Lily, my precious grandchildren, would rush through the kitchen like small tornadoes, grabbing protein bars and juice boxes before Jessica hurried them to their private school in her gleaming SUV. Sometimes I'd catch Lily's eye and smile, remembering the little girl who used to beg for my sugar cookies, but she'd look away quickly, as if acknowledging me might get her in trouble. "Good morning, sweethearts," I'd whisper as they passed, but they never seemed to hear me anymore. I'd started a small garden in the corner of their backyard, just a few tomato plants and herbs like I'd grown on the farm. It gave my hands something to do, something that felt familiar in this sterile environment. But Jessica had asked me to move it behind the tool shed where guests couldn't see it from the patio. "It's just not the aesthetic we're going for," she'd explained with that tight smile she reserved for conversations she found unpleasant. That particular morning, as I stood in the kitchen nursing my coffee and watching birds at the feeder I'd hung outside my window, I heard voices coming from the living room. Jessica was on one of her phone calls with her sister, the ones that always seemed to involve complaints about something or someone. I moved closer to the doorway, not to eavesdrop, but because the coffee pot was in that direction and I needed a refill. That's when I heard it. "I swear, the entire bottom floor smells like old lady." Jessica's voice carried clearly through the open door. Her tone was sharp, exasperated, the way she talked about the gardener when he left grass clippings on the driveway. I don't know if it's her perfume or her medications or just, I don't know, decay. I can't take it anymore. Her room stinks. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen in the doorway, my coffee mug suspended halfway to my lips, watching my daughter-in-law pace back and forth across the living room that had never felt like a place where I belonged. And she cooks these weird old-fashioned meals, Jessica continued, her voice gaining momentum. The whole house smells like, I don't know, nursing home food. I've started buying those expensive air fresheners and placing them strategically, but nothing works. She's like this presence that just hangs over everything. I stepped backward, my slippers silent against the marble floor, and pressed myself against the wall in the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it. Andrew won't say anything, of course, Jessica went on. He just pretends like everything's fine, but I see how uncomfortable the kids are. They don't want to bring friends over anymore. Can you blame them? What teenager wants to explain why their grandmother is living in what basically amounts to the servants' quarters? The coffee mug slipped from my fingers and crashed against the floor, sending ceramic shards and hot coffee across the pristine marble. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Jessica's voice stopped abruptly. I knelt carefully, my arthritic knees protesting, and began gathering the broken pieces. This mug had been George's favorite, the one he'd drunk his morning coffee from for 23 years. I'd washed it by hand every day, had protected it through 2 moves and countless busy mornings. Now it lay in fragments on a floor that had never wanted it there in the first place. "Everything okay out there?" Jessica called, her voice artificially bright. "Just clumsy," I called back, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll clean it up." As I picked up the pieces, each shard felt like a small death, not just of the mug, but of the illusion I'd been clinging to that this arrangement might somehow work, that I might eventually find my place in their carefully orchestrated life. That evening, I sat in my room as the sounds of family life filtered through the walls. Andrew helping Ben with homework, Jessica discussing weekend plans, the television playing some show they all watched together in the living room where I no longer felt welcome. The air freshener Jessica had placed outside my door released its artificial lavender scent every 15 minutes, a constant reminder that my presence needed to be masked, neutralized, made acceptable. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out a small photo album I'd kept hidden beneath my sweaters. Page after page of memories. George and me on our wedding day, Andrew taking his first steps across our farmhouse kitchen, family picnics under the old oak tree, Christmas mornings when the house was full of laughter and the scent of cinnamon rolls. In every photo, I was surrounded by people who loved me, who wanted me there, who saw me as essential rather than inconvenient. When had I become someone whose very existence needed to be apologized for? I closed the album and looked at myself in the mirror across the room. 79 years old, gray hair that I still styled every morning out of habit, blue eyes that had seen decades of joy and sorrow, hands that had worked hard, loved deeply, built a life alongside a man who'd cherished every day we'd shared. Was I really just a burden now? A problem to be managed until some more permanent solution could be found? The questions hung in the air like smoke, acrid and inescapable, as I prepared for another restless night in a house that felt less like home with each passing day. The broken mug incident haunted my dreams that night, but it was nothing compared to the flood of memories that came rushing back as I lay in the darkness. Memories of everything I'd given, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd poured into this family that now treated me like an unwelcome stranger. I remembered the day Andrew called me, 3 years ago, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, I need help. The business is failing. Jessica's pregnant with the twins, and we're about to lose the house. I know it's a lot to ask, but..." I didn't even let him finish. The next morning, I was at the bank in our small farming town, sitting across from Mr. Peterson, who'd handled our accounts for 30 years. George had been gone only 6 months, and I was still learning to make decisions alone, still reaching for his hand during difficult conversations that weren't there anymore. "Eleanor, are you sure about this?" Mr. Peterson asked, his weathered face creased with concern as he reviewed the papers. "This is your entire life savings. Everything you and George worked for, $47,000. Every penny we'd saved from decades of farming. of selling eggs and vegetables at the farmer's market, of George working construction jobs during winter months when the land rested. Money we'd planned to use for our golden years, for the trips we'd dreamed about but never taken because there was always something the farm needed first. Andrew needs it, I'd said simply, signing the papers with the same pen George had used to sign our mortgage 35 years earlier. Family comes first. The money had saved Andrew's consulting business, allowed him to keep the house where Jessica was building her perfect life. Within 2 years, his company had recovered and was thriving. He'd sent me a thank you card with a generic message and a photo of the twins as newborns. No mention of paying it back. No acknowledgement that I was now living on Social Security alone while he drove luxury cars and took vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. But that wasn't the first time, was it? I turned onto my side, pulling the thin blanket closer as more memories surfaced like bubbles in dark water. There was Andrew's college tuition. George and I had mortgaged our farm twice to pay for his education at Northwestern University, the school Jessica had attended, where he'd met her at some fraternity party. 4 years of tuition, room and board, spending money so he could focus on his studies, instead of working part-time like most of his classmates. We'd eaten beans and rice for months while our check cleared for his spring break trip to Cancun. George had worn the same winter coat for 10 years, patching holes with duct tape rather than buying a new one, because Andrew needed money for textbooks and a laptop. "It's an investment in his future," George would say when I worried about our dwindling savings. "He'll take care of us when we're old." When Andrew graduated summa cum laude, he'd hugged us at the ceremony and promised he'd never forget what we'd sacrificed for him. The next week, he'd moved to Chicago and taken a job with a consulting firm. His calls became monthly, then holidays only. Then just Christmas and my birthday, if I was lucky. I'd driven myself to George's cancer appointments because Andrew was swamped at work and couldn't get away. I'd sat in waiting rooms alone, holding George's hand while nurses explained treatment options and side effects, making decisions about the man I'd loved for 53 years while our son attended client dinners and company retreats. The night George died, I'd called Andrew at 2:47 a.m. His phone went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Finally, Jessica answered on the 4th call, her voice annoyed and sleepy. "Eleanor? It's the middle of the night. What's wrong?" "George is gone," I'd whispered, my voice breaking. "He passed an hour ago. Could you please put Andrew on? He's sleeping. Can this wait until morning?" I'd stared at the phone, at the love of my life lying still in our bed, at the 47 years of marriage certificates and photos and shared dreams that now felt like echoes in an empty house. "No," I'd said quietly. "It can't wait." Andrew had arrived 2 days later, staying long enough for the funeral and to discuss next steps for my living situation. He'd stood in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made him breakfast every day before school for 18 years, and told me the farm was too much responsibility for someone my age. "Mom, you can't maintain this place alone," he'd said, not meeting my eyes as he surveyed the house like he was appraising it for sale. "The roof needs work. The plumbing is old. What if you fall and no one finds you for days?" Jessica had nodded sympathetically while opening cabinets and examining our simple dishes, our mismatched furniture, our life's collection of humble treasures with the expression someone might wear while touring a thrift store. "We have plenty of room," she'd added, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm, "and it would be so nice for the children to spend more time with their grandmother." Except the children barely acknowledged my existence. Ben, now 14, was too busy with his elite private school and travel soccer team to notice me. Lily, 12, spent her time in dance classes and coding camps that cost more than George and I had spent on groceries in a month. I'd given up my independence, my home, my garden, my neighbors who'd known me for 40 years, my church where I'd sung in the choir since I was 16. I'd given up my identity as Eleanor Wells, farmer's wife, pillar of the community, woman who knew her own worth. In exchange, I'd become a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. But even here, even feeling like an intruder in my own son's home, I'd continued giving. When Lily mentioned wanting piano lessons, I'd used my grocery money to pay for her first month of instruction. When Ben needed new soccer cleats, I'd taken money from the small emergency fund I kept hidden in my underwear drawer. When Jessica complained about the cost of the twins' summer camp, I'd quietly covered the difference, telling myself it was what grandmothers were supposed to do. Last month, when Jessica's book club was meeting at the house, she'd asked me to maybe stay in your room so the ladies could have their space. I'd spent 3 hours listening to their laughter echo through the walls, smelling the expensive wine and catered appetizers I wasn't invited to share, wondering when I'd become someone who needed to be hidden away like a family secret. The worst part wasn't the money I'd given. It wasn't even the loneliness or the feeling of being unwanted. It was the slow, creeping realization that I had trained them to treat me this way. Every time I'd said yes when I wanted to say no. Every time I'd smiled when my heart was breaking. Every time I'd made myself smaller to accommodate their comfort. I'd taught them that my feelings didn't matter, that my needs were secondary, that my love came without conditions or expectations of reciprocity. George used to tell me I was too generous, too trusting. "Eleanor, honey," he'd say when I'd lend money to neighbors who never paid it back or volunteer for every church committee that needed help. "You can't save everyone. Sometimes people have to save themselves." But I'd believed that family was different. I'd believed that the love I poured out would eventually come back to me, that the sacrifices I made would be remembered with gratitude, that growing old in the shelter of family meant being cherished rather than tolerated. As dawn light began filtering through the curtains of my basement room, I heard the familiar sounds of the household awakening above me, footsteps on the marble floors, the coffee machine grinding beans, Jessica's voice directing the children to hurry with their breakfast. Normal family sounds that I was no longer part of. I reached for my Bible on the nightstand, the same leather-bound King James version that George had given me on our first Christmas as newlyweds. Its pages were soft with age, marked with decades of underlined verses and margin notes written in my careful script. I opened to a passage I'd highlighted years ago, during another difficult time when I'd questioned whether my giving heart was a blessing or a curse. "Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." For 79 years, I'd mastered the innocent dove part. Maybe it was time to learn about serpents. A soft knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. "Eleanor?" Jessica's voice carried that artificially sweet tone she used when she needed something. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" I set down my Bible and opened the door to find her standing there in her yoga clothes, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, her smile as polished as the marble floors she walked on. "I hope I didn't wake you," she said, though we both knew the household had been awake for 30 minutes. "I wanted to talk to you about Lily's piano competition. The entry fee is rather expensive, and with all our other expenses." She trailed off, letting the request hang in the air between us like incense in an empty church. I looked at her expectant face, at the designer workout clothes that cost more than my monthly Social Security check, at the diamond earrings that caught the light from the hallway chandelier. "Of course," I heard myself saying, the words automatic as breathing. "How much do you need?" But even as I agreed, even as I watched relief flood her features, a small voice in my head whispered a question that would change everything. Was I being used? The question haunted me for days. Was I being used? It followed me through my morning routines, whispered to me during the long afternoons when the house fell silent, and kept me awake at night staring at the ceiling while the washing machine hummed its endless cycle next door. I began noticing things I'd trained myself to overlook, like how Jessica would suddenly remember my helpful nature whenever bills arrived, how Andrew would call me Mom, with that particular warmth in his voice only when he needed something, how the twins would acknowledge my existence primarily when they wanted me to drive them places Jessica was too busy to handle. The morning after Jessica asked for Lily's piano competition money, I watched my granddaughter eat breakfast at the kitchen island. She sat hunched over her phone, fingers flying across the screen, completely absorbed in whatever digital drama occupied 12-year-old girls these days. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, setting a plate of fresh blueberry muffins on the counter. I'd been up since 5 a.m. baking them, using the last of my special vanilla extract that I'd been saving. Lily glanced up for barely a second. "Thanks," she mumbled, then returned to her phone. I stood there, tea towel in my hands, waiting for more, waiting for her to notice that I'd remembered blueberries were her favorite, waiting for her to ask about my day, or tell me about hers, or acknowledge that I was more than just a food-dispensing fixture in her peripheral vision. But she didn't. She grabbed a muffin without looking, took 2 bites, then wrapped the rest in a napkin and tossed it in her backpack. "I'm going to be late," she announced to no one in particular, sliding off the stool. I watched her walk away, this child I'd held as a newborn, whose first steps I'd witnessed, whose every milestone I'd celebrated with more enthusiasm than her own parents. When had I become invisible to her? That afternoon, while cleaning my room, I found something that made my blood run cold. I'd been dusting the small desk by my window when I noticed papers scattered underneath it. They must have fallen from the stack Andrew kept on top, documents he'd been reviewing for what he called financial planning purposes. As I bent to retrieve them, my eyes caught familiar words on the letterhead. Last Will and Testament of Eleanor Marie Wells. My hands trembled as I picked up the papers. This was my will, the one I'd updated after George's death. But why did Andrew have a copy in my room? I'd given him one for safekeeping, but this looked different. There were notes scribbled in the margins, calculations written in Andrew's distinctive handwriting. My breath caught as I read his annotations. Farm sale proceeds, $340,000. Life insurance, $50,000. Savings remaining, approx $8,000. Total estate value, $398,000. At the bottom of the page, in red ink, Jessica's handwriting, minus what we've already borrowed, still substantial inheritance. Borrowed. They considered the money I'd given them freely to be borrowed. Money they'd never mentioned repaying, never acknowledged as sacrifice, never thanked me for beyond those perfunctory holiday cards. But there was more. Stapled to the back was a printout of nursing home costs in the Chicago area, with several facilities circled and notes about Medicare coverage and asset spend-down requirements. They weren't just waiting for me to die, they were planning for it, calculating exactly how much my life was worth to them and researching the cheapest way to warehouse me until that inheritance became available. I sank into the small chair by my window, papers scattered across my lap, feeling like I might vomit. The room spun around me as the full scope of their betrayal crashed down like a collapsed roof. Every kindness I'd interpreted as love had been an investment in their future windfall. Every time Andrew had called me Mom with affection, he'd been calculating compound interest on my mortality. Every time Jessica had smiled and asked about my day, she'd been mentally spending my estate. That evening, I sat through dinner like a ghost at my own wake. Andrew carved the roast Jessica had prepared, discussing his day at work while she nodded attentively. The twins ate in their usual silence, still attached to their phones despite the no devices at dinner rule that apparently applied only when convenient. "Mom, you're quiet tonight," Andrew observed, spooning gravy onto his plate. "Everything okay?" I looked at him across the table. This man I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood illnesses, cheered for at every baseball game and school play. His face was pleasant, concerned even, but I could see calculation behind his eyes now that I knew what to look for. "I'm fine," I said quietly. "Just tired. You should rest more," Jessica added with that bright, artificial concern. "At your age, you need to take better care of yourself. At your age." As if being 79 was a character flaw I needed to manage better. As if my aging body was an inconvenience they had to endure until nature solved their problem for them. After dinner, while they settled into their evening routine of television and homework supervision, I retreated to my room and made a decision that should have been obvious months ago. I was going to leave. Not in a dramatic storm of accusations and tears. Not with explanations or confrontations or attempts to make them understand how deeply they'd wounded me. I was simply going to gather what remained of my dignity and walk away from people who saw me as nothing more than a financial portfolio with a pulse. That night, I began making plans with the methodical precision George had taught me. First, I needed to secure my important documents, my Social Security card, Medicare information, birth certificate, and George's life insurance papers. Andrew had insisted on keeping them safe in his filing cabinet, but I knew where he hid the key. Second, I needed to contact my bank and ensure Andrew had no access to my remaining accounts. The realization that he might have been monitoring my finances sent fresh waves of betrayal through my chest. Third, I needed somewhere to go. The farmhouse was gone, sold to a young family who'd promised to restore its gardens and raise their children in its sun-filled rooms. But there were other options. Senior living communities that valued independence rather than just providing storage for inconvenient elderly relatives. The next morning, while the family rushed through their usual breakfast chaos, I made my move. Jessica was arguing with Ben about his soccer uniform. Andrew was shouting orders from upstairs about traffic delays. Lily was having a meltdown about a test she'd forgotten to study for. I slipped into Andrew's office and retrieved my documents from his filing cabinet. The key was exactly where he'd always kept it, taped under the desk drawer, because he'd never been particularly creative about hiding places. As I gathered my papers, I found more evidence of their planning. A folder labeled Eleanor Future Care Options contained brochures for state-subsidized nursing facilities, applications for Medicaid assistance, and a timeline that suggested they'd been expecting my transition to professional care within the next 6 months. One brochure was circled in red: Sunset Manor, basic care, starting at $1,200 a month. The highlighted text read, family members are encouraged to visit during designated hours. Personal belongings should be limited to what fits in provided storage space. They'd already picked out my cage. I photographed everything with the smartphone Lily had taught me to use last Christmas, back when she still seemed to enjoy my company. Then I carefully returned the documents to their original positions and locked the cabinet. Walking back to my room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my thinking was lifting, replaced by a cold, bright understanding of exactly where I stood in my family's priorities. I was an asset to be managed, not a person to be loved. That afternoon, while the house was empty, I called the number on a business card I'd kept in my wallet for years. Grace Morrison, the nurse's aide who'd helped care for George during his final months. She'd been so kind, so genuine in her compassion, that I'd tucked her card away thinking maybe someday I'd need someone who actually cared about my well-being rather than my will. Mrs. Wells, Grace's voice was warm with surprised delight. How wonderful to hear from you. How are you doing? For the first time in months, someone had asked that question and actually wanted to hear the answer. I've been better, I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. Grace, I need help. Not medical help, but I need to make some changes in my living situation, and I don't know where to start. Of course, she said without hesitation. I have tomorrow afternoon free. Would you like me to come over so we can talk? Actually, I said, looking around at the sterile guest room that had never felt like home, could we meet somewhere else? Maybe that little cafe downtown where they serve real coffee? Grace laughed, a sound like silver bells. Perfect. I'll bring information about some excellent senior communities I know. Places where people actually want to live, not just exist. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my chair by the window and watched a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside. The bright red flash of his feathers against the gray October sky seemed like a sign, a reminder that even in the darkest seasons, there could still be moments of startling beauty. For the first time since George's death, I felt something that had been missing so long I'd forgotten its name: hope. That evening, as I listened to the familiar sounds of family life happening without me in the rooms above, I made a list of everything I wanted to take with me when I left. It wasn't much. George's clothes still hung in my closet, bringing me comfort on the hardest nights. Our wedding photo, my Bible, the quilt my mother had sewn. Everything else, the accumulation of a lifetime that had once seemed so important, suddenly felt like anchors weighing me down. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of freeing myself from people who had confused my love with their entitlement. Tomorrow, I would start learning how to be Eleanor Wells again, instead of just Andrew's inconvenient mother. Tonight, for the first time in months, I fell asleep without crying. My meeting with Grace at Murphy's Cafe downtown was like stepping into sunlight after months in a basement. She arrived 10 minutes early, her warm smile and genuine embrace reminding me what it felt like to be welcomed rather than tolerated. "Eleanor, you look tired," she said as we settled into a corner booth, her brown eyes full of the kind of concern that expected no payment in return. "Are you sleeping well?" Over coffee and apple pie that actually tasted like my grandmother's recipe, I told her everything. About the broken mug and Jessica's cruel words. About finding the will with their calculations. About the nursing home brochures and the cold realization that I'd become nothing more than a financial investment they were waiting to cash in. Grace listened without judgment, occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze my hand when my voice broke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee with thoughtful precision. "Eleanor," she said finally, "you know this isn't normal, right? The way they're treating you isn't how families are supposed to work." I nodded, feeling tears prick my eyes. "I keep thinking if I just try harder, if I'm more helpful, less trouble." "Stop." Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "You've already given them everything. Your money, your home, your independence, your dignity. How much more do they want? Your soul." She pulled out a folder filled with brochures and printed pages. "These are places where people your age live by choice, not by default. Where you'd have your own space, your own autonomy, your own life. Where being 79 is seen as having 79 years of wisdom, not 79 years of burden." The communities she showed me were nothing like the sterile nursing home Andrew and Jessica had selected. These were active senior living complexes with libraries and gardens, art studios and walking trails, places where residents had book clubs and cooking classes, where they traveled together and volunteered in their communities. "Morningside Gardens has a waiting list," Grace explained, pointing to a photo of a beautiful apartment with large windows and a small kitchen. "But they sometimes have emergency openings for people in difficult situations." I could make a call. That afternoon, while Andrew was at work and Jessica was at her yoga class, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. First, I called my bank and removed Andrew from all my accounts. The customer service representative was patient as I explained that circumstances had changed and I needed complete control over my finances. "Mrs. Wells," she said carefully, "I see your son has been making regular transfers from your savings to his checking account. Were you aware of these transactions?" My blood went cold. "What kind of transfers?" "Let me see. Monthly withdrawals of $800 for the past 6 months. They're marked as household contribution, so I assumed you'd authorize them. $800 a month. Nearly $10,000 total. Money I'd never agreed to give, never been asked about, never even known was missing because I'd trusted Andrew to manage the account statements I could no longer read clearly due to my declining vision. "I want those transfers stopped immediately," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I want printed statements for the past year sent to a different address." My second call was to Morningside Gardens. The director, Mrs. Patterson, had a voice like honey over steel, warm but authoritative. When I explained my situation in general terms, she offered to meet with me that very evening. "Mrs. Wells, we've had several residents join us after family difficulties," she said diplomatically. "Sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones who understand us least. Would 6 o'clock work for you?" My third call was to a taxi company. I was done asking for rides, done being dependent on people who saw every favor as a debt I owed them. When Andrew came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room, not hiding in my basement quarters, not making myself invisible, sitting in their pristine white chair like I had every right to occupy space in what was still technically my son's home. "Mom!" He seemed genuinely pleased to see me, that practiced warmth flooding his voice. "How was your day? Jessica mentioned you went out this afternoon." "Yes," I said simply. "I had some errands to run." "Errands?" Jessica appeared from the kitchen, her yoga clothes exchanged for the kind of casual but expensive outfit she wore when she wanted to look effortlessly put together. "What kind of errands? You should have asked me to drive you." I took a taxi. The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew and Jessica exchanged a look I recognized now, the same expression they'd worn when discussing my future care options in whispered conversations they thought I couldn't hear. "Mom," Andrew said slowly, sitting down across from me, "taking taxis can be expensive. And at your age, going out alone, what if something happened? What if you got confused or lost?" "I'm 79, not senile," I replied, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. Jessica perched on the arm of Andrew's chair, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of united concern. "Eleanor, we're just worried about you. You haven't seemed like yourself lately. Maybe we should schedule you an appointment with Dr. Martinez, just to make sure everything's okay." There it was. The subtle suggestion that my growing independence was actually evidence of declining mental capacity. If I started asserting myself, started making my own decisions, clearly something was wrong with my brain that needed medical intervention. "I'm fine," I said. "Actually, I'm better than I've been in months." "You seem different," Andrew pressed. "Distant. Are you upset about something? Because if we've done something wrong..." The performance was masterful. The concerned son, the caring daughter-in-law, both so worried about my well-being. If I hadn't found those nursing home brochures, if I hadn't seen my will covered in their financial calculations, I might have believed them. "I've been thinking about my living situation," I said carefully. Both of them went very still. "What about it?" Jessica asked, her voice higher than usual. "This arrangement isn't working for me anymore. I think it might be time for me to find my own place." Andrew's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, concern, and then something that looked suspiciously like panic. "Mom, you can't be serious. You can't live alone. What about your medication? Your doctor's appointments? What if you fall?" "I managed those things for 79 years before moving in here." "But that was different," Jessica interjected. "You're older now, more fragile. And the expenses alone. Mom, senior living facilities cost thousands of dollars a month. You can't afford that on Social Security." I almost laughed at the irony. They'd been calculating my net worth down to the penny, but now suddenly I was too poor to afford basic housing. "I've been looking into some options," I said. "I think I can manage." "Options?" Andrew's voice cracked slightly. "What kind of options?" "Mom, you can't just make major life decisions without talking to us first. We're your family. We need to be involved in these choices. The way you were involved in choosing Sunset Manor?" Dead silence. Jessica's face drained of color. Andrew's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jessica said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "The brochures in Andrew's office, the one with the basic care package circled in red. Were you planning to ask my opinion about that choice? Or was I supposed to be grateful for whatever warehouse you selected?" Andrew stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "Mom, you went through my private papers?" "My will was mixed in with your private papers, along with calculations about my estate value and notes about money you've borrowed from me. We were just trying to plan ahead, to make sure you're taken care of if something happens. By stealing $800 a month from my bank account?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Jessica's face went from pale to flushed. Andrew sank back into his chair like a deflated balloon. "We weren't stealing," he said weakly. "We were using that money for your care. Your food, your utilities, your share of the household expenses." "My share of the household expenses for living in the basement next to your laundry room? $800 a month for the privilege of being hidden from your guests and told my existence stinks? That's not fair," Jessica snapped, her composure finally cracking. "We opened our home to you. We've fed you, housed you, included you in our family. Do you have any idea how much stress this has put on our marriage? How hard it's been to explain to our friends why we have a live-in grandmother? Do you know what people say about families who can't afford professional care for their elderly parents?" The mask was off now. No more pretense of loving concern. No more performance of dutiful children caring for an aging parent. This was about their image, their convenience, their financial planning. "So this has all been a burden," I said quietly. "That's not what she meant," Andrew started, but Jessica cut him off. "Yes, Eleanor, it has been a burden, a huge one. But we've done it anyway because we're good people who believe in family responsibility. And now you want to throw that back in our faces? Move out on your own like some kind of rebellious teenager?" I stood up slowly, my arthritis making the movement deliberate and careful. Both of them watched me like I might collapse or explode. "You're right," I said. "This has been unfair to all of us. You shouldn't have to bear the burden of caring for someone you see as a liability, and I shouldn't have to live somewhere I'm not wanted." "Mom, wait." Andrew reached for my arm, but I stepped back. I'll be moving out within the week. You can have your basement back for storage, like it was always meant to be. That night, they knocked on my door every hour. First Andrew alone, then Jessica alone, then both together, each time with a different approach, pleading, reasoning, guilt-tripping, even crying. But I'd already made my choice. Grace had called with good news. Morningside Gardens had an emergency opening. A one-bedroom apartment with a garden view, available immediately for someone in transitional circumstances. The next morning, while they were at work and school, I packed my few belongings into the suitcases I'd brought 8 months earlier. Grace arrived with a friend who owned a moving truck, and together we transported the remnants of my old life to the beginning of my new one. I left a note on the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker I'd used every morning to make coffee no one ever shared with me. Thank you for teaching me the difference between being family and being home. I've found somewhere I can be both. Eleanor. As we drove away from the house that had never welcomed me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since George died. Freedom. The feeling was so foreign, so unexpected, that I started crying in the passenger seat of Grace's car. But for the first time in months, they were tears of relief rather than despair. My first morning at Morningside Gardens, I woke up without the sound of a washing machine rumbling through the walls. The silence was so profound, so peaceful, that for a moment I forgot where I was. Then sunlight streamed through windows that faced east instead of north, and I remembered. I was free. The apartment was small but perfect. A living room with a fireplace I could actually use. A kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out onto a garden where residents grew tomatoes and herbs, and a bedroom that didn't smell like industrial detergent. Everything was mine to arrange, mine to enjoy, mine to inhabit without permission or apology. I made coffee in my own pot, using the good china cups I'd rescued from storage. No more chipped mugs or hurried mornings trying to stay invisible. I sat at my small dining table and watched an elderly man tend to the flower beds outside, humming while he worked. When he noticed me at the window, he smiled and waved. A real smile, not the practiced pleasantry I'd grown accustomed to. The first week passed like a dream. I attended the welcome orientation for new residents, where Mrs. Patterson introduced me to a community of people who'd chosen to be there, not warehoused by families, not hidden away until death claimed them, but actively living in a place designed for their comfort and dignity. "We have book club on Tuesdays," said Margaret Chen, a tiny woman of 83 who'd been a librarian for 40 years. "And don't let the name fool you. We argue more than we read." Last month, Dorothy threw her copy of The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo at Harold because he said romance novels weren't real literature. Harold, a distinguished gentleman with a white beard and twinkling eyes, laughed from across the common room. "I stand by that statement, but I apologize for the bruise." I found myself laughing too, actually laughing, for the first time in months. When was the last time I'd been part of a conversation where people valued my opinion, where my presence added to the group rather than detracting from it? "Eleanor, you have that look," Grace said when she stopped by on Thursday evening with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. "What look?" "The look of someone remembering who they used to be." She was right. Each day, without walking on eggshells, without measuring my words for fear of causing inconvenience, without hiding parts of myself to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be, I felt more like Eleanor Wells and less like Andrew's burdensome mother. I joined the gardening committee and found myself planning a herb garden that would remind me of the farm. I signed up for the weekly shopping trips to the farmer's market, where I could choose my own vegetables without checking if they met Jessica's aesthetic standards. I even attended a painting class, something I'd always wanted to try, but had never allowed myself the time or space to explore. But my newfound peace was shattered on Saturday morning when my phone rang at 7 a.m. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Andrew's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Good morning to you too, Andrew." "Don't good morning me. You disappeared. You left a note like you're some kind of runaway teenager instead of talking to us like adults." I settled into my comfortable armchair, the one I'd positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. "I tried talking to you. You responded by questioning my mental competency and suggesting I needed medical evaluation. Because we're worried about you. Mom, you're making impulsive decisions. Moving into some random facility without letting us inspect it first, without considering the financial implications. The financial implications for whom? Silence. Andrew, I'm quite comfortable here. I have my own space, my independence, and people who actually enjoy my company. Why is that problematic for you? It's not problematic, it's just, Mom, how much is this place costing you? Because if you're burning through your savings on luxury senior living, there won't be anything left for emergencies. Or for the future. There it was. The real concern wasn't my happiness or well-being. It was the potential depletion of their inheritance. I'm managing my finances just fine, thank you. Are you? Because I checked our joint account, and you've made some very concerning changes. You removed my access, which makes it impossible for me to help you pay bills or handle emergencies. I also discovered you'd been helping yourself to $800 a month without my knowledge. That would be concerning to most people. That money was for your care. Your room and board, your portion of utilities, groceries. $800 for a basement room and whatever leftovers you didn't want? Andrew, my entire monthly budget here, including meals, activities, and a beautiful apartment, is less than what you were stealing from me. We weren't stealing. Yes, you were. Taking money from someone's account without their knowledge or permission is theft, regardless of your relationship to the victim. The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Less aggressive, more wheedling. Mom, I know we haven't been perfect. Maybe Jessica and I got a little stressed trying to balance everything. But running away isn't the answer. Come home and we'll work things out. We'll do better. This is my home now. That's not your home. Your home is with your family, your son and your grandchildren who love you. Do they? Because when I lived there, Lily barely acknowledged my existence. Ben treated me like furniture. You hid me from your social obligations, and Jessica complained about my smell to her friends. You were listening to private conversations. In my own home. Yes. Or what I thought was my home. Turns out I was just a temporary tenant paying rent I didn't know I owed. Another long pause. When Andrew spoke again, I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, sharp and insistent. Mom, the kids miss you. They've been asking when you're coming back. It was a lie, and we both knew it. But the fact that he was willing to use the children as emotional weapons told me everything I needed to know about how desperate they'd become. If the children want to see me, they're welcome to visit. I'm not hiding from them. I'm just not available to be taken for granted anymore. Visit? Mom, you're 20 minutes away. It's not like we can just drop by. No, I suppose that would require actually making an effort to spend time with me, rather than just coexisting in the same building. That afternoon, Jessica called. Her approach was different. Tears, guilt, and emotional manipulation wrapped in maternal concern. Eleanor, I'm so sorry, she sobbed into the phone. I know I haven't been the daughter-in-law you deserved. I know I said terrible things, and I've been selfish and inconsiderate. But please, please come home. The children are devastated. Ben keeps asking where Grandma went, and Lily cries herself to sleep because she thinks she did something wrong. If this had been true, it might have worked. The Eleanor of 3 months ago would have packed her bags immediately, overcome with guilt at the thought of causing her grandchildren pain. But I'd spent enough time at Morningside to meet other grandparents who maintained healthy, loving relationships with their grandchildren without sacrificing their own well-being. Jessica, if the children want to maintain a relationship with me, I'm absolutely open to that. But it will be a relationship built on mutual respect, not one where I'm expected to purchase their affection with money and servitude. That's not. We never expected you to purchase anything. No? Then why did every conversation about spending time with the children involve requests for money? Piano lessons, soccer equipment, camp fees, competition entries. When was the last time someone in your family spent time with me just because they enjoyed my company? The question hung in the air like incense in an empty church. We do enjoy your company, Jessica said, but the words sounded hollow even to her. Jessica, I hope someday that becomes true. But right now, I need to focus on rebuilding a life where my worth isn't measured by my usefulness to other people. Monday brought a surprise visitor. I was watering the herb seedlings I'd planted in small pots on my patio when someone knocked on my door. Through the peephole, I saw Lily standing in the hallway, fidgeting with her backpack straps. I opened the door slowly, unsure what to expect. "Hi, Grandma," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Mom dropped me off. She said you lived here now." "I do. Would you like to come in?" She nodded and stepped inside, looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity of someone exploring a foreign country. She examined my small living room, my kitchen with its cheerful yellow curtains, my photographs arranged on the mantelpiece. "It's nice," she said finally. "It smells like cookies and flowers." I almost smiled. "Would you like some cookies? I baked snickerdoodles yesterday. Those are my favorite." I remember. We sat at my small dining table, the afternoon light streaming through windows that belonged to me. Lily ate 3 cookies and drank a glass of milk while I watched this child I'd almost given up hope of connecting with. "Grandma," she said suddenly, "are you mad at us?" The question was so direct, so unexpectedly honest that it took my breath away. "I'm not mad, sweetheart. I'm sad, but I'm also hopeful." "Why are you sad?" "Because I felt invisible when I lived at your house, like nobody really saw me or cared about what I thought or felt." She considered this with the seriousness children bring to important matters. "I saw you," she said quietly. Mom said not to bother you because you were tired all the time and needed rest." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jessica hadn't just been hiding me from their social circle. She'd been actively preventing the children from building relationships with me, framing my presence as a burden they needed to tiptoe around. "Lily, I was never too tired to spend time with you. I would have loved nothing more than to hear about your day, help with your homework, or just sit and talk." Her eyes filled with tears. "Really? Really?" We spent the next hour talking about school, her friends, her art projects, and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. She was intelligent, funny, and kind. Everything I'd hoped she'd become but had been prevented from witnessing. When Jessica's car pulled up outside, Lily hugged me tight. "Can I come back next week?" she whispered. "Anytime you want, sweetheart. But only if you want to, not because anyone tells you that you should or shouldn't." She nodded solemnly and gathered her backpack. As I watched her walk to the car, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope for a genuine relationship with my granddaughter, built on mutual affection rather than obligation or guilt. That evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized something profound had shifted. For the first time since George's death, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. The phone rang again around 8 o'clock. Andrew's number appeared on the screen, but I didn't answer. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, opened a book I'd borrowed from Margaret's lending library, and settled into my comfortable chair by the window. For the first time in months, I had nowhere I needed to be, no one I needed to please, and nothing I needed to prove. I was finally home. 3 weeks into my new life, they arrived unannounced. I was in the community garden, kneeling beside my herb plot with dirt under my fingernails for the first time since George died, when I heard familiar voices arguing in the parking lot. Through the hedge that bordered the garden, I could see Andrew's luxury sedan, its engine still running, exhaust billowing into the crisp October air. "This is ridiculous, Jessica," Andrew was saying, his voice carrying that edge of barely controlled frustration I remembered from his teenage years. "We should have made an appointment. Just showing up like this makes us look desperate." "We are desperate." Jessica's response was sharp enough to cut glass. "She's been here almost a month, Andrew." "A month? Do you realize how much money she's spending? How much she's potentially giving away to strangers who don't even know her?" I remained crouched behind the tomato plants, my hands still in the soil, listening to them discuss my life like I was a wayward stock investment rather than a human being. "Mom always said I could count on my inheritance to help with the kids' college funds," Andrew continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Now she's living in some commune, probably being brainwashed by people who want to get their hands on her money." "It's not a commune," Jessica snapped. "I looked it up online. It's one of those expensive senior communities where lonely old people go to feel important. They probably have financial advisors trolling the hallways, convincing residents to leave money to the facility instead of their families. My hands stilled in the dirt. Even their imagined version of my life was centered around their financial concerns rather than my well-being. We need to be smart about this, Jessica continued. Emotional appeals haven't worked. Maybe it's time to consider other options. What kind of other options? Legal ones. She's showing signs of diminished capacity, making impulsive financial decisions, isolating herself from family. Any judge would see that she needs a conservatorship for her own protection. The words hit me like ice water. A conservatorship would give them complete control over my finances, my living situation, my medical care, my entire life. I would become a legal child again, unable to make decisions about where I lived or how I spent the money George and I had earned through decades of honest work. I stood slowly, brushing soil from my knees, and walked toward the parking lot with the measured pace of someone who'd finally learned her own worth. "Hello, Andrew." "Jessica." My voice was calm, steady, giving no hint of the conversation I'd just overheard. They turned in unison, their faces cycling through surprise, guilt, and then carefully manufactured concern. "Mom!" Andrew rushed forward with his arms extended, as if our relationship was still built on physical affection rather than financial calculation. "You look different." I did look different. 3 weeks of sleeping through the night, eating meals I'd chosen for myself, and engaging in conversations where my opinions mattered had restored something to my face that I'd lost during those months in their basement. Color in my cheeks, light in my eyes, the posture of someone who knew she belonged exactly where she was. "I feel different too," I replied, accepting his embrace while remaining emotionally distant from it. "What brings you here?" "We wanted to see where you're living," Jessica said, her eyes scanning the well-maintained buildings and landscaped grounds with the expression of someone calculating property values. "Make sure you're safe." "I'm very safe. Would you like a tour?" They exchanged a look that I now recognized as silent communication about their shared agenda. "That would be wonderful," Andrew said. "We've been worried about whether this place is appropriate for someone your age with your needs." My needs. As if I required special accommodation, rather than simply the same respect and autonomy afforded to any adult human being. I led them through the community center, where Margaret was leading her afternoon book discussion in voices loud enough to be heard 3 counties away. Harold was at the piano, playing jazz standards while Dorothy sang along in a voice that had probably been beautiful 50 years ago and remained enthusiastic today. The art studio hummed with quiet creativity as residents worked on paintings, pottery, and crafts that would never be dismissed as old lady hobbies. "It's very active," Jessica observed, watching an 80-year-old man demonstrate proper putting technique to a group of women who were clearly humoring him. "Don't you find all this stimulation exhausting?" "I find it energizing. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm living instead of just existing." Andrew examined everything with the critical eye of someone conducting an inspection. He asked pointed questions about security, medical facilities, emergency protocols, all reasonable concerns that might have touched me if I hadn't overheard him discussing conservatorship proceedings 10 minutes earlier. When we reached my apartment, they stepped inside with the cautious air of people entering potentially hostile territory. "It's smaller than I expected," Jessica said, surveying my living room with its comfortable furniture and personal touches. "It's perfect for me. I don't need much space, just enough room to be myself." "But Mom," Andrew settled into my armchair without invitation, "don't you miss having family around? Don't you get lonely here with all these strangers?" "These strangers have become friends faster than I ever imagined possible. And I see Lily every week now. She visits because she wants to, not because someone tells her she has to." "About that," Jessica's voice took on an edge that I'd learned to recognize as the prelude to ultimatums. "We've been thinking that maybe those visits should be more structured, more supervised. You know, to make sure Lily doesn't feel burdened by having to entertain you." The mask was slipping again. They couldn't control me anymore. So they were going to control my access to my granddaughter. "Lily doesn't entertain me, Jessica. We spend time together. We bake cookies, work on her art projects, talk about books. You know, the things grandmothers and granddaughters have been doing for centuries. Yes, but at her age, she needs to focus on her future. College preparation, extracurricular activities. Time spent visiting elderly relatives, while sweet, isn't really productive for her development. Elderly relatives. Not her grandmother. Not family. Elderly relatives who were impediments to Lily's productivity. I see. I moved to the kitchen and began making tea. My hands steady despite the rage building in my chest. And what about Ben? Does he also need protection from his unproductive elderly relative? Ben is going through a difficult phase, Andrew explained, accepting the cup I offered him. Teenage boys don't really want to spend time with grandparents. It's nothing personal. Everything about this situation is personal, Andrew. The tea was my grandmother's china. Delicate cups with hand-painted roses that had survived the Depression, World War II, and 7 decades of family gatherings. I'd rescued them from storage when I moved to Morningside, and using them daily had become an act of defiance against the utilitarian mindset that valued things only for their immediate function. Mom. Andrew set down his cup and leaned forward with the earnest expression he'd perfected for difficult conversations. We need to talk seriously about your future. This place is nice, but it's expensive. At the rate you're spending money, you'll exhaust your savings within a few years. My financial situation is stable, thank you. Is it? Because from what I can see, you're paying premium prices for services you don't need. Wouldn't it make more sense to move back home where your family can take care of you for free? Free. As if the $800 a month they'd been stealing, plus the emotional cost of daily humiliation, equaled free care. Andrew, I tried living with family. It didn't work. Because we made mistakes, Jessica interjected, her voice taking on the pleading tone she used when reason failed to achieve her goals. But we've learned from those mistakes. We know how to do better now. Do you? Because 5 minutes ago you were discussing conservatorship proceedings in the parking lot. The silence that followed was deafening. Andrew's face went pale. Jessica's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of guilt that crept up her neck. You were listening to a private conversation? Jessica said finally, her voice tight with indignation. I was gardening. You were conducting that private conversation in a public parking lot at sufficient volume to be heard by anyone within 50 feet. Mom, conservatorship isn't about controlling you, Andrew said carefully. It's about protecting you from people who might take advantage of your trusting nature. People like my son who steals from my bank account? That's not the same thing, and you know it. Isn't it? You took money without permission, justified it with expenses I never agreed to pay, and now you're threatening legal action to regain access to my finances. How is that different from the financial abuse you're claiming to protect me from? Andrew stood abruptly, pacing to my window that looked out over the garden where I'd been peacefully working before their arrival. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said, his voice rising. You've become paranoid, suspicious of your own family. These people here, they're filling your head with ideas about independence and autonomy. But Mom, you're 79 years old. You have Parkinson's. You take 6 different medications. You can't see well enough to drive at night. At some point, reality has to matter more than your feelings. My reality is that I'm happier and healthier than I've been since your father died. My feelings matter because they're mine. And for the first time in months, I don't have to apologize for having them. Jessica joined Andrew at the window, and together they stared out at the community that had welcomed me with open arms. Eleanor, please be reasonable, Jessica said, her voice taking on the coaxing tone she used with the children when they resisted bedtime. We're not the enemy here. We're your family. We love you. Then prove it. What? Prove that you love me. Not my money, not my usefulness, not my potential inheritance. Prove that you love me as a person. They looked at each other, then back at me, as if I'd asked them to solve advanced calculus. We don't need to prove anything, Andrew said finally. Love isn't something you prove. It's something you feel. Love is something you demonstrate, I corrected, through actions, choices, priorities. And your actions have demonstrated very clearly what your priorities are. I walked to my bedroom and returned with a manila folder I'd prepared for exactly this moment. These are copies of my bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, I said, placing the documents on my coffee table. These are photographs of the nursing home brochures I found in your office. with your notations about costs and care levels. These are copies of my will with your calculations about my estate value. The papers lay between us like evidence in a criminal trial. This is what love looks like to you, I continued. Financial planning around my death, theft disguised as household contributions, and housing arrangements made without my input or consent. Mom, you're taking everything out of context. No, Andrew, I'm finally seeing everything in its proper context. You don't love me. You love what I represent to your financial security. You don't want me in your life. You want control over my assets until they can be transferred to you more permanently. I opened my front door and held it wide. I think it's time for you to leave. Mom, we're not finished talking. Yes, we are. You can have a relationship with me based on mutual respect and genuine affection, or you can continue plotting ways to control my money and my life. But you can't have both. You're making a mistake, Jessica said as they gathered their coats. When you're lying in a hospital bed with no family around because you've alienated everyone who cares about you, you'll regret this stubbornness. Jessica, I've been lying in metaphorical hospital beds for months, surrounded by family who saw my pain as an inconvenience to be managed rather than comfort to be offered. I'll take the risk of facing real illness surrounded by people who chose to care about me, rather than people who felt obligated to tolerate me. As their car pulled away from the parking lot, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief so profound it brought tears to my eyes. I had finally stopped trying to earn love from people who had no intention of giving it. I had finally chosen my own dignity over their approval. For the first time since George died, I felt truly free. That evening, Margaret knocked on my door with a bottle of wine and a knowing smile. "Rough day?" she asked, settling into my armchair like she belonged there. "Clarifying day," I replied, pouring 2 glasses of wine in my grandmother's crystal goblets. "Those are often the most difficult kind," she said, raising her glass. "To clarity, and to the courage to act on it. To freedom," I replied, "and to choosing family that chooses you back." We drank to that, and to the sunset painting my windows gold, and to the sound of laughter drifting up from the courtyard where my neighbors, my real family, were enjoying their evening together. I was finally home. 6 months after that final confrontation, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Gone were the hollow cheeks and perpetually tired eyes of someone who'd been slowly disappearing into herself. My face had filled out from eating meals I actually enjoyed instead of picking at leftovers no one else wanted. My hair, which I'd started having professionally styled at the salon here in the community, framed my face in soft silver waves that caught the light. Most remarkably, I was smiling. Not the forced, apologetic expression I'd worn for months, but a genuine smile that started in my eyes and radiated outward. "Eleanor, you're practically glowing," Grace said when she arrived for our weekly coffee date. She'd become more than the angel who'd rescued me from that hospital bed. She'd become my dearest friend, the sister I'd never had but had always wanted. "I feel like I'm glowing," I admitted, pouring coffee into the good china that I now used every single day. "Yesterday, Harold told me I looked 10 years younger than when I first moved in. Harold's been trying to ask you to the community dance for 3 weeks." Grace laughed. "The poor man turns red as a beet every time you walk into the dining room." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. At 79, I was rediscovering the forgotten pleasure of being noticed, appreciated, even flirted with by someone who saw me as a woman rather than a burden. "Don't be ridiculous. We're just friends. Friends who happen to sit together at every meal, work side by side in the garden, and take evening walks that last suspiciously long for people our age," Grace teased. "Eleanor, honey, when was the last time you let yourself be courted by a gentleman?" The question caught me off guard. George had been the love of my life, my partner for 53 years, and I'd assumed that chapter of my life had closed with his death. But Harold's gentle attention, his way of saving me the choicest vegetables from the garden, his habit of leaving small wildflower bouquets by my door, it awakened something I'd thought was buried forever. I wouldn't know how to be courted anymore, I confessed. I've been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. I've forgotten how to just be Eleanor. Then it's time to remember. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I bought a new dress. Not a practical, serviceable dress chosen for durability and ease of washing, but a beautiful royal blue dress with tiny pearl buttons that made me feel elegant and feminine. The saleswoman at the boutique in town was probably younger than Lily, but she treated me with the respect of someone helping another woman prepare for something special. "This color is perfect with your eyes," she said, adjusting the sleeves. "Are you shopping for a special occasion?" "I'm shopping for myself," I replied, and realized it was the first time in years I'd bought something simply because it made me happy. The community dance was held every Friday evening in the main dining room, where they moved aside the tables, and Harold played piano while couples swayed to music from their youth. I'd attended before, sitting with Margaret and Dorothy, watching the dancers and telling myself I was too old, too rusty, too recently widowed to participate. But that Friday, wearing my royal blue dress and the pearl earrings George had given me for our 40th anniversary, I walked into that room ready to dance. Harold's face lit up when he saw me. He was wearing a navy blazer and tie, his white hair neatly combed, looking distinguished and nervous in equal measure. "Eleanor," he said, rising from the piano bench, "you look absolutely radiant." "Thank you, Harold. That's a lovely piece you're playing. The way you look tonight," he said, his eyes twinkling, "seemed appropriate for the occasion." When the next song began, a gentle waltz that transported me back to high school dances and wedding receptions, Harold extended his hand with old-fashioned courtesy. "Would you honor me with this dance?" I placed my hand in his, felt his warm palm against mine, and remembered what it was like to be led across a dance floor by someone who was happy to be there with me. Harold was a graceful dancer, confident without being pushy, attentive without being overwhelming. As we moved together to the familiar melody, I felt decades of tension leave my shoulders. "I was afraid you'd forgotten how," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "I was afraid I had too," I replied. "But apparently, some things you never really forget." "Like riding a bicycle," he agreed, "or falling in love." The words hung between us, gentle and honest and full of possibility. I looked up into his kind brown eyes and saw something I'd almost forgotten existed, the chance for companionship built on choice rather than obligation, affection offered freely rather than extracted through guilt or manipulation. "Harold, I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of conversation." "Then we won't have it tonight," he said simply. "Tonight, we'll just dance." And we did, song after song, until my feet ached pleasantly and my heart felt lighter than it had in years. When the evening ended, Harold walked me to my apartment like a proper gentleman, kissed my hand like we were characters in an old movie, and told me he'd had the most wonderful evening he could remember. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror again. My hair was slightly mussed from dancing, my cheeks were flushed from laughter and gentle exercise, and my eyes sparkled with something I'd thought was lost forever: joy. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was tending my herb garden, wearing my oldest jeans and a University of Illinois sweatshirt that had belonged to George, when I heard a familiar voice call my name. "Grandma Eleanor?" I turned to see Ben standing at the garden gate, looking uncertain and older than his 14 years. He'd grown several inches since I'd last seen him, his voice deeper, his face showing the first signs of the man he'd become someday. "Ben," I said, setting down my watering can and walking toward him. "What a wonderful surprise." "Mom doesn't know I'm here," he said quickly. "I took the bus. I told her I was going to soccer practice, but I wanted to see you." My heart clenched with a mixture of joy and concern. "Is everything okay at home?" He shrugged with the elaborate nonchalance teenagers use to mask deep feelings. "I guess. It's just different since you left. Quieter. Mom and Dad argue more. And Lily keeps asking when you're coming back, and they keep saying you're not, and I wanted to see for myself if you were okay." I gestured toward the small patio area outside my apartment. "Would you like to sit down? I could make us some lemonade." "That would be cool." As I prepared drinks in my kitchen, I watched Ben through the window, taking in his surroundings with the analytical eye he'd inherited from his father. He examined the garden, the other residents visible in the distance, the well-maintained buildings and walkways. "This place is actually pretty nice," he said when I returned with glasses and a plate of cookies. "Not like the nursing homes they show in movies." "It's not a nursing home," I explained. It's a community for people who want to maintain their independence while having support when they need it. Like college for old people? I laughed at his description. I suppose that's not a bad comparison. People here are learning new things, making new friends, exploring interests they never had time for when they were younger. Ben ate 3 cookies while asking surprisingly mature questions about my living situation, my activities, my happiness. His concern seemed genuine, not prompted by adult coaching, and I found myself having the kind of conversation with my grandson that I'd always hoped we'd share someday. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you really leave? I mean, I know Mom and Dad say it was because you wanted more independence, but he trailed off, struggling with words too big for his teenage vocabulary. But you suspect there was more to it than that? He nodded. I considered how much truth to share with a 14-year-old whose world was already complicated by parents who'd never learned to separate their needs from everyone else's. Ben, sometimes adults make choices that seem harsh or confusing, but are actually acts of self-respect. I left because I realized I was living in a situation where I couldn't be myself, where my needs and feelings didn't matter as much as other people's convenience. So you weren't happy with us? The pain in his voice broke my heart. This child had been caught in the middle of adult manipulations and betrayals he was too young to understand. Ben, my unhappiness had nothing to do with you or Lily. You're both wonderful kids, and I love you more than you can imagine. But love isn't always enough to make a living situation work. Do you think you'll ever come back? I think I'll always be your grandmother, no matter where I live. And I think the relationship we build now, as you become a young man, can be whatever we choose to make it. We spent the next hour walking through the community, with Ben meeting Harold, who was impressed by his knowledge of baseball statistics, and Margaret, who immediately invited him to help with the community newsletter. By the time he needed to leave to catch his return bus, Ben seemed more relaxed, more understanding of my choice. Grandma, he said as we reached the bus stop, I'm sorry if we made you feel bad when you lived with us. I didn't know. You didn't make me feel bad, sweetheart. You were just being a kid, which is exactly what you were supposed to be doing. Can I come visit again? Like regularly? I would love that. But Ben, I won't be the secret you keep from your parents. If you want to maintain a relationship with me, it needs to be honest and open. He considered this with the seriousness of someone weighing important adult decisions. I'll talk to them, he said finally. Maybe they'll understand better now that they've seen this place isn't some weird cult or whatever they were worried about. As his bus pulled away, I felt something shift inside my chest. For months, I'd grieved the loss of my grandchildren, convinced that choosing my own well-being meant sacrificing my relationship with them. But Ben's visit showed me that real love, the kind built on genuine affection rather than family obligation, could survive geographic distance and even parental manipulation. That evening, I called Lily to tell her about Ben's visit. Her excitement was infectious as she made plans for her own trip the following week, this time with her parents' knowledge and reluctant permission. Grandma, Ben said you have a boyfriend, she said with the delighted scandal of a 12-year-old who'd discovered adult romance. I have a good friend who happens to be a gentleman, I corrected, though I couldn't keep the smile out of my voice. Ben said he brought you flowers. Harold is very thoughtful. Do you think you'll marry him? The question caught me completely off guard. Marriage hadn't even entered my thoughts. I was still adjusting to the idea of companionship, of someone wanting to spend time with me for the simple pleasure of my company. Lily, honey, I think I'm still learning how to be happy on my own. Romance is wonderful, but it's not something I need to complete me anymore. But do you think you might want it anyway? Not because you need it, but because it would be nice? Out of the mouths of babes. My 12-year-old granddaughter had just articulated something I hadn't been able to express. The difference between desperate need and joyful choice. Yes, I said slowly. I think I might want it anyway. That night, as I prepared for bed in my own space, surrounded by my own choices, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. 6 months ago, I'd been a shadow haunting someone else's house, grateful for scraps of attention and terrified of being further burden. Now, I was a woman with friends, interests, options, and even the possibility of romance. I was no longer just surviving George's death or Andrew's rejection or Jessica's cruelty. I was living, fully, joyfully, authentically living for the first time since I could remember. As I turned off the lights and settled into my comfortable bed, I could hear Harold playing piano in the community room, the melody of The Way You Look Tonight, drifting through my window like a lullaby. Tomorrow, I would tend my garden, attend book club, have lunch with Grace, and maybe, if I felt brave enough, tell Harold that I'd like to have that conversation about falling in love after all. Tomorrow, I would continue the work of blooming again. 1 year later, I sit in my garden on a crisp autumn morning, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink that remind me of the watercolor class I started last month. My hands, once trembling with anxiety and Parkinson's, are steady as I hold my coffee cup, the same chipped mug that George used to drink from, now a cherished reminder of love that was real rather than a symbol of everything I'd lost. Harold is beside me in the matching chair he brought from his apartment when we decided to merge our morning coffee ritual. We don't talk much during these early hours. We've learned that comfortable silence is one of the gifts of deep friendship. He reads his newspaper while I tend to my thoughts, both of us content in the knowledge that we're exactly where we choose to be. "Penny for your thoughts," he says, looking up from the sports section with the gentle smile that still makes my heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. "I'm thinking about time," I tell him, how much I thought I'd wasted and how much I actually had left. Harold folds his paper and gives me his full attention. At 82, he's learned that when someone wants to share their thoughts about time, it's worth listening. "When George died, I thought my life was essentially over," I continue, watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder we hung together last spring. "I thought I was just marking time until I could join him, existing on the charity of family who saw me as an obligation rather than a gift. And now I realize I confused the end of one chapter with the end of the entire book." Harold reaches over and takes my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that's become as natural as breathing. We're not married, may never be married, but we've built something precious together, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared interests, and the rare luxury of choosing each other every single day. "Your book isn't finished yet," he says. "Hell, you might just be getting to the good part." He's right. This past year has been the most fulfilling of my adult life, not despite my age, but because of the wisdom it's brought me. I've learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between family and relatives, between surviving and thriving. Last month, Andrew called. Not Jessica. She hasn't spoken to me since that final confrontation in my apartment. But Andrew, probably prompted by the children's growing relationship with me, reached out with what sounded like genuine concern. "Mom, how are you really doing?" he asked. And for the first time in years, his voice carried no ulterior motive I could detect. "I'm doing wonderfully, Andrew. Better than I have in a very long time. The kids say you're different. Happier. I am happier. I'm living the life I choose rather than the life others expect me to accept." There was a long pause. "Mom, I want you to know that I've been thinking about how things went between us. I know we made mistakes." "We?" Another pause, longer this time. "I made mistakes. I let myself think about your finances more than your feelings. I let Jessica convince me that managing your life was the same as caring about it." It wasn't a full apology. Andrew still couldn't quite admit the extent of their betrayal, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd expected to receive. "Andrew, I appreciate that. But I need you to understand something. I don't need you to take care of me anymore. I never did. What I needed was for you to love me without conditions, to value my presence without calculating its cost. Can we try to rebuild something? Not the old relationship, but something new?" I'd considered this question many times over the past year. The answer came easily now. Yes, but only if you can accept me as I am now, not as the convenient grandmother you want me to be. I won't move back into your house. I won't pretend to be helpless so you can feel important. I won't apologize for having a life that doesn't revolve around your needs. "Okay," he said quietly. "I think I can do that. Then we'll see." Relationships are built on actions, not promises. Since then, we've had coffee twice. Awkward conversations where we've both had to learn new ways of relating to each other. Andrew is slowly discovering that I'm more interesting as an independent person than I ever was as a dependent parent. I'm learning to see him as a flawed human being rather than the perfect son I'd created in my imagination. It's progress, even if it's slow. Ben visits every other weekend now, officially this time. He's become my technology consultant, helping me navigate the tablet I bought to take digital art classes and video call with Grace when she travels to visit her own grandchildren. Lily comes monthly, and we're working on a cookbook together. Her favorite recipes from my collection, updated for modern kitchens and documented so they won't be lost when I'm gone. "Grandma," she said during her last visit, "I want to ask you something, but I don't want to hurt your feelings." "Ask away, sweetheart. I'm tougher than I look. When you lived with us, were you pretending to be happy? Because I remember you smiling a lot, but now I know what you look like when you're really happy. And it's different." The question was so perceptive, so honest, that it took my breath away. "Yes, Lily. I was pretending. I thought if I smiled enough, if I was helpful enough, if I asked for little enough, eventually people would want me around instead of just tolerating me." That's sad. It was. But you know what? Learning to stop pretending was one of the best things I ever did for myself. Now when I smile, it's because I mean it. She nodded with the wisdom children sometimes possess about emotional truths adults complicate. "I'm glad you stopped pretending, Grandma. I like the real you better. The real me." At 79, I was finally meeting her for the first time. Harold and I finish our coffee as the community comes alive around us. Margaret walks by with her daily newspaper delivery route, stopping to remind us about tonight's movie screening. Dorothy waves from her balcony where she's hanging laundry in deliberate defiance of the community's rule about clotheslines. Her small act of rebellion that everyone pretends not to notice. The Johnsons from Building C are heading out for their morning walk, still holding hands after 62 years of marriage. This is my world now. Not perfect, not glamorous, but genuine. A place where I'm valued for who I am rather than what I can provide. Where my age is seen as an accumulation of experience rather than an expiration date approaching too quickly. "Eleanor," Harold says as we gather our coffee cups and prepare to start our day, "do you ever regret leaving your family?" I consider the question seriously. A year ago, the answer would have been immediate and guilt-ridden. Now, I understand that leaving my family's house wasn't the same as leaving my family. I regret that it took me so long to value myself enough to demand better treatment. I regret that I taught people to see me as disposable by acting like I was. But leaving? No. Leaving was the first honest thing I'd done in years. Any advice for people who might be in similar situations? The question surprises me. Harold knows my story, but he's never asked me to distill it into lessons before. Stop waiting for permission to live your life, I say without hesitation. Stop believing that your worth depends on other people's approval. Stop accepting crumbs of affection from people who should be offering you full meals of love and respect. That's harder than it sounds when you're lonely and scared. Everything worthwhile is harder than it sounds. But you know what's even harder? Spending the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to bet on yourself. Harold smiles and kisses my cheek with the gentle affection of someone who's learned that love doesn't diminish with age. It just becomes more precious because we understand how rare it is. As I prepare for my day, watercolor class at 10, lunch with Grace at noon, book club at 3, dinner with Harold at 6, I marvel at how full my calendar has become. Not with obligations I dread, but with activities I chose because they bring me joy. Tonight, Harold and I are attending the community's monthly dance. I bought another new dress last week, deep emerald green that brings out my eyes and makes me feel beautiful in a way I thought was lost forever. We'll dance to the music of our youth, surrounded by friends who celebrate our happiness rather than resenting it. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with a lawyer to update my will. Not because Andrew and Jessica have pressured me, but because I want to ensure my money goes to places and people who will use it to spread kindness rather than enabling selfishness. Grace will receive a substantial gift. Morningside Gardens will get a donation for their scholarship fund that helps people of limited means afford community living. The children will receive modest amounts when they turn 30, old enough to appreciate rather than simply expect inheritance. The rest will go to organizations that support seniors in transition. People like I was a year ago who need help remembering their own worth. This evening, as I stand in front of my mirror preparing for the dance, I see a woman I recognize and admire. Silver hair styled beautifully, skin that shows every year I've lived but glows with health and contentment, eyes that sparkle with anticipation for whatever comes next. I am 79 years old. I am strong, independent, loved by choice rather than obligation, and happier than I've been since I was a young woman discovering the world for the first time. I am not waiting to die. I am learning to live. And if there's someone out there, someone listening to my story who feels invisible, unwanted, taken for granted, I want you to know this. It's never too late to write a new chapter. It's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to discover that the life you're settling for is not the life you have to keep. You are worth more than the scraps of attention people throw your way. You deserve more than being tolerated by people who claim to love you. The question is, do you believe it enough to do something about it? Because if you do, if you're ready to stop accepting less than you deserve, then maybe, just maybe, your best chapter is still waiting to be written. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Or do you know someone who has experienced this kind of treatment? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so we can share this message with someone else who needs to hear it.